Hi, everybody. I'm just wanting to jump in here so that I can just give you a little bit of an overview of what we're going to focus on for this week. And hopefully, you've been already thinking about it this past week after you finish your annotated bibliography. But as you saw in my message a few days ago, the next step is to write your literature review. And that is, you're essentially taking what you did for your annotated bibliography and putting it together in a way that makes sense by sections or by categories to have a nice sort of flow of a review of the literature on your topic. Okay, so I posted a copy of a sample literature review and how that was organized. So I want to just kind of go through that today. But before we do that, I did spend obviously some time going through your annotated bibliographies, and I just spend way too much time, like, within the formatting, which is not something that I'd like to spend too much time on in the future. So I really want you to go and look for the resources that I have for you here. For instance, this is one of the first things that I posted on, because this is one of the things that are going to be critical for you all to know: how to use APA citation style. And this is a link to one of my favorite websites on APA formatting. And it's completely free, and everything's accessible here for you. But you can do all of these overviews, but I just like to go to the style guide here, and you can just see the various rules. So for your references list and for your in-text citations. The in-text citation is what goes in the paragraphs, in the actual paragraphs. And this is specifically for the references list that goes at the very end of your work. All right, so just make sure you pay attention to that. Another thing that I wanted to say is, actually, let's just look at it really quickly. Just pay attention to how they do in-text citations. So according to the last name of the researcher, always parentheses with the year, comma, and then, if it's a quote, then you must include a page number. All right, and the period always goes outside of the parentheses. There's specific rules for long quotations, and there's rules for summary or paraphrase. Page numbers for paraphrase or summary is not required. And I might have commented on some of you. So for your literature review, your quotations are to be kept at a minimum. You're mostly doing synthesis of the readings, right? And paraphrasing. So you're not using a lot of quotations. So just a heads up on that. There are rules. If there's one author or two, there's a specific rule you have to use an ampersand, right? If it's within the sentence, you have to use the whole word and. All right, so just pay attention to those things. There's a specific rule if there's 3 to 5 authors. There are specific rules if there are 6 or more authors. So just make sure you look at the various rules, okay? Another thing that was also that I saw a little bit of is indirect citations. So let's see if I have that here. Yes, so indirect citations, pay attention to how you are looking at that because that's really important. You want to look for as many as the original articles as possible. All right, but I understand they're not always accessible, but there is a way that you can format that properly so that you are noting that you are citing something from an article that you read. So, kind of like it says, an indirect citation. So just make sure you are aware of all of those rules and how to go about using those. All right, so just make sure to keep that in mind. Okay, so I think we can go back here. So what you're going to do is you're going to think about, well, what are the overall sort of subcategories that I have going on here in my annotated bibliography? Obviously, they're all going to be connected by one topic, which is, led by your research question, right? But the next thing you're going to do is you're going to start maybe even thinking about doing an outline. So I'll just kind of start a sample here. And as I mentioned before, I didn't call my chapter on my literature review. I actually gave it a title because all of my literature review was covering the topics of bilingualism, translanguaging, and educational equity. So instead of giving it the generic literature review title for that chapter, I called it something else. You don't have to do this, but you do have that option. But you can just start, by calling it the literature review or the lit review, and then start by looking at, well, let me look at my annotated bibliography. What are these subcategories that I have? So maybe one subcategory is history of EBL education, right? Kind of like what I have here, or review of programs for EBLs, kind of like that. Like, what does all of the literature say about the review for programs or on programs for EBLs? Maybe the literature, the next category that you're seeing in your your collected bibliography has to do with some other subtopics. So I'm just going to be kind of generic here. All right, and then subtopic 4. So you want to just come up with a few categories that you see reflected from your annotated bibliography and sort of start putting it together, right? So right now they're probably, most of them are in alphabetical order, maybe, right, your annotated bibliography. But now you're going to look at the trends. Like what are these 3 readings about? Okay, they belong in separate categories. Or what are these 2 readings about? Okay, they both talk about programs for EBL, so they should be under the same section. All right, so that's what you're going to do, and then start adding from your annotations or from your annotated bibliography and putting them into actual paragraphs. I'm sorry for all these emails that keep popping up, but that's what you're going to start doing. And as you can see here, I have this is my connected to the topic. My topic is on bilingualism, translanguaging, and educational equity, so that's why I called it this. But these are all of the areas of the literature that I reviewed that are connected directly to this larger topic, right? So, so then you'll see the very first paragraph, I talk about exactly the areas of literature review or the literature that I reviewed for this chapter. And in this case, I reviewed 7 areas, right? And I divided my review accordingly into 7 sections. And then I went and talked about what each section is going to do, or what each section is going to cover, just really, really briefly. And then we get into it. So this is the first sort of subtitle, I guess. So the first major section is that I reviewed is the literature on the history of bilingual education. So I have that whole section here. But even within that, I kind of created some subsections because within the history of bilingual education, well, I looked at bilingual education in the US context specifically. And then I kind of narrowed it down and looked at, well, what does it have to do with accountability, like, race to the top and all of those sort of policies, right? But I narrowed it down even further from the US to specifically looking at the history of bilingual education in New York, which is where this study took place. All right, and then I talked about specifically about the programs for EBL students in New York City. So New York is a state, New York City is a totally different area, right? So New York City specifically has specific programs for EBLs that maybe are not, established in the whole state. So that had its specific subsection. And you don't have to do this so detailed like this, but I'm just giving you an idea. For you all, for your purpose, you really only need this sort of larger category, this larger subcategory. You don't have to do all of these smaller categories unless you feel like you really do need to separate them. Okay, so that's up to you. All right, so this is my next area of research that I'm reviewing, right? So now I'm looking at specifically the research on bilingual education. So before I was looking at the literature on the history of bilingual education. Now I'm looking at the research, right? So it's a new category. And then I did break it up into smaller categories, so the positive effects of bilingual education, etc. Right? And then the next one is bilingualism in education. So that's a separate category, a new section like I wrote here, right? Again, it has its own section. And as you can see, a lot of this is, like I said, we don't want too many quotes, direct quotes. A few are fine, but you're mostly paraphrasing. All right, so just keep that in mind. All right, so I think we skipped a little bit. Okay, so this is a new section. This is about specifically on translanguaging. And translanguaging, I mean, there's so many researchers are writing similarly about this sort of topic, but they call it something else. So I decided to make those subsections of that larger category. So some call it transidiomatic practices. Some call it polylingual languaging. Some call it translingual practices. So all of these code meshing, I mean, there's a lot of words for kind of like what we know as translanguaging, hybrid language practices, code switching, right? All right, and then I talk about what translanguaging as actual pedagogy, as practice does, or what the literature says it does, right? And then again, a new section. So I'm talking about educational equity. So I'm kind of making the connection between using translanguaging basically as a right of human beings, and we have linguistic human rights, and I talk a little bit about that. So I reviewed that literature, and then I reviewed the literature on dynamic bilingualism specifically. So that's this, and then about educational equity. So that's what you see here. All right, and then I kind of have a conclusion to kind of tie it all up and looking at, again, the areas of literature that I reviewed and how it connects to my larger topic. All right, and then I go into my theoretical framework, which is what you did before, but you're going to hopefully edit and then kind of like slap it onto the end of your lit review. All right, so, and mine was really short, as you see here. So I just wanted to take these few minutes to kind of go through this together, but that's the next step. So look at your annotated bibliography. See what categories are emerging from that. See how you can section it off. And then that's how you start shaping your literature review. Don't forget that first paragraph is really important, right? Give us a clue, or give me a clue of what areas of literature you're reviewing, and list them just like I do here. You can use this as a model if you like. Remind us what you're doing, right? And then give us a little bit of a clue of what each section is going to cover, and then begin. Okay, pay attention to the headings. Look at okay, so this is the heading. So level 1 is sort of center, uppercase, and lowercase headings. Level 2 is left align, boldface, uppercase, and lowercase headings. So level 1 is this, bold, uppercase, right, in the first letter. And all right, so where are we at? So you know where to find the APA citation style. It's under syllabus and resources. My sample paper is here. And honestly, you just have to, you have to make sure to put in the work, right? You have to view all of the materials here. And I do have like the step-by-step instructions on how you might want to go about this. But you do want to review all of these documents. I did, take the time and look at them, and for a reason. So make sure you're looking at all of these resources, okay? Because the questions that you may have for me, or the mistakes that you may be making, the answers are most likely going to be in here. There's also that PowerPoint that Dr. Doyle sent me to post for you all, Demystifying the Lit Review, look at that as well. So make sure you look at your resources for the module very carefully, because honestly it's already there for you. But I just wanted to touch base and just kind of go through this lit review again and tell you about how you might want to approach this by creating maybe a little outline first for yourself, looking at the categories that are emerging from your annotated bibliography, and then move on from there to drafting your first paragraph, and then take it one section at a time. All right, so we're shooting for a deadline of Sunday at night, but so we'll just see how we are and go from there. All right, so thanks for listening. Bye.